today. And so just hold on for a minute or two while we do that. I think Dave, Kirsten needs to be given co-host and screen sharing privileges.
Done. And the meeting is now being streamed onto YouTube as well.
Terrific. So yeah, so just so everyone knows that we'll be recording the entire meeting, and it'll be actually recorded and posted to our DRPC YouTube channel as well. So thanks everyone for attending today on this beautiful day, which I'm sure a lot of people would like to be outside, but here we are with our update on this project. So first thing I wanted to do was just acknowledge our project funders, who is NOAA's Office of Coastal Management under the Coastal Management Program through the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Coastal Program for funding of this project as a NOAA project of special merit. We appreciate their funding for this. So for those of you who may be new to this project, we started this project about almost a year ago, I would say. And this project really kind of grew out of the work that's been ongoing in the Seacoast, New Hampshire, with respect to evaluating the impacts of sea level rise and coastal storms related flooding to infrastructure, natural resources, private and public property, and other assets in the Seacoast. And what came out of a lot of those studies, which were called Tides to Storms 2, Coastal Risk in the Seacoast, which is the Sea Rise project in the inland areas, was a need to really dive a little bit deeper into the impacts onto our transportation network. We had we had mapping from all of those projects that indicated where vulnerabilities lie in the coastal region as far as the transportation network. But we didn't really have a firm grasp of exactly what that meant. So there's impact here at this site. So what does that mean? Especially, what does it mean to our transportation network and its functionality? So if a segment of roadway were to be impacted such that traffic could not pass, through it either way, what would that do to the traffic pattern and the traffic volumes, and where would the traffic actually be diverted to? Would it be to another state road, to a local road? What does that mean for the condition of those roads where enormous amounts of traffic may be diverted to on a regular basis? But trying to get a handle on what would what the future scenarios of flooding would change the way that we actually, our traffic patterns and how we actually move about in the Seacoast. And so we sort of designated an area to look at, and we were focusing on the Route 1A corridor itself. But then moving westward, we included Route 1, which actually has flood impacts in a few locations and definitely has major connections to Route 1A, and then over to Route 95, which is one of the major connectors to a lot of those roadways. And then we kind of expanded a little bit further westward to include local east-west roads that run through towns like Exeter, Stratham, and Greenland, and also out to Newington and Portsmouth and Newcastle, where the transportation network goes beyond the state highway system and transcends to a lot of our local roadways. So that's just sort of a general overview of kind of what we're trying to do. So I think our RPC staff, Dave Walker and Christian Matthews, are going to be going through in a lot of detail about the modeling that we've done, the transportation modeling that we've done with respect to evaluating the flooding and how the transportation network would respond to that type of to impacts of flooding. So we'll do that a little bit later in the agenda. So first of all, I just kind of wanted to go over I think I sent out our basic agenda. So after I do this, we'll go through some introductions of our project team and also the folks that are on the line for the call from our participating municipalities. And then we'll go through and do a summary of the travel model and the methodology behind that and the results and some of the challenges that we had in actually calibrating that model. And then review some of the sites that we've looked at in detail, with respect to flooding impacts and transportation, movements. And then we'll open it up for a discussion, an open discussion for participants to ask questions. And then Kirsten Howard from the Coastal Program, New Hampshire Coastal Program, will present an example of using one of the sites that we've selected in the transportation model as a high impact site. And she'll go through the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Guidance, which is a sort of a methodology and an analysis tool to evaluate the impacts at a specific site. And so she'll go through that, and then we'll do a wrap up and next steps after that. So just sort of some sort of like how we're gonna kind of organize how we're doing things here today. What we'd like to do is do the introductions, and what I'll do is I'll call on our project partners to call out and say if they're here, and I'll call out each one of the towns that are participating in the project and see if anyone is participating today in the video conference. And then during the presentations, we're going to mute everyone so the presentations can happen. So what we'd like you to do, if you're familiar with how to use the functions in Zoom, is to use the chat box. If you have any immediate questions that you'd like to ask during the presentations, type them into the chat box, and I'll be keeping tabs on those, and I'll call those out as they come in. But use that sparingly, just in case, just only if you really have a really important question that you need to have clarified. And then what we'll do is once we get to the discussion phase, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A after each one of the presentations, and we'll use the raise hand function. So if you can just raise your hand, we'll keep tabs on who's wanting to ask questions during the discussion phase, and we'll call on you individually. We'll probably at that point unmute everybody so that you will have a chance to, once we call on you, to ask your question, whether you're on the phone or if you're actually using the video option on the Zoom call. I think that's sort of how we would like to structure this today. So again, use the chat function during the presentations. I think each one of the presenters are going to pause a little bit during their presentations and ask if anyone has any questions, so we can have some room to answer any questions that are in the chat box. So presenters, just don't forget to pause here and there, like maybe halfway through or a third way through, and ask if there are any questions, and we can be keeping track of the questions that arise in the chat box. So that's sort of where we're headed right now. So I think what we'd like to do is do introductions. So if we would like to unmute people, Dave, that would be great. Or if individuals, if you have the opportunity or the capability to unmute yourself, I think there are a couple of people who are probably muted, and maybe that's your choice, so that's fine.
Yeah, so, Bob Ladman, I'm here.
Oh, thanks, Bob. So I forgot to introduce myself. I'm sorry. I'm Julie LaBranch. I'm a senior planner with the Rockingham Planning Commission, and I'm the RPC project manager for the Seacoast Transportation Corridor Vulnerability Assessment Project. Anyone else from RPC? We have Dave and Christian, I believe, and Tim Roach, our director.
I guess I'll start. Dave Walker, Assistant Director with RPC and Transportation Program Manager. I'm working on the transportation planning aspects of this project.
Hey, I'm Christian Matthews. I'm the Transportation GIS Analyst at Rockingham Planning Commission, and I am assisting with the transportation analysis.
And I'm Tim Roach with the Rockingham Planning Commission. Here, just listening in today and just giving some, oversight to the overall project along with Julie.
Great. And our coastal program partners at the New Hampshire DES. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Howard. I'm the Resilience Program Coordinator for the Coastal Program at DES. Natalie? Wanna go?
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Morrison DiGeronimo. I'm the Resilience Project Manager with the DES Coastal Program.
Kevin?
Awesome.
And
And we
hi,
have
folks. This
some
is sorry, Julie. This is Kevin Lucy with the DES Coastal Program. I focus on habitat issues.
Thanks, Kevin. I always forget your iPad. So.
And we also have
And our
Tiffany-
partners and our partners with the New Hampshire Department of Transportation are present here today.
Julie, we also have Tiffany Chin, who's from our program, so we'll just let
Oh,
her.
didn't
introduce
know.
herself.
I'm sorry. Tiffany,
Hi.
you'd like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Tiffany Chin, and I am the Coastal Management Specialist with the New Hampshire Coastal Program.
So our transportation, New Hampshire Department of Transportation partners who are on the call.
Yeah, hi, I'm William Rose. I'm the Policy and Planning Manager with the Bureau of Planning and Community Assistance at the Department of Transportation.
Thanks, William. Thanks for coming today. And then we have our partners from the University of New Hampshire. And I think we have two folks there.
Hi, this is Joe Sias from the University of New Hampshire. And so I'm part of the project team on the pavement evaluation aspect side of things.
And I'm Jennifer Jacobs. I'm in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UNH as well, and partnering with Joe on the transportation assets. Nice to be here.
Okay, it looks like we have a couple of municipal participants here. Bob Landman.
Yes, Northampton, I'm on the TAC, and Mike Tully, our town administrator, just sent me the notes and said, I guess I'm appointed to do it. Nobody.
So Northampton, Bob Landman is a planning commission commissioner for many years. And he sits on the Transportation Advisory Committee. Is that true?
Yes.
And I also see that Matt Scruton is here also from, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Matt Scruton, Town Administrator in Greenland.
Great. I'm not sure there's anybody else that we haven't called on for introductions. So I think we're ready to move into our presentations, I think. So I think the first thing we'd like to do, we'd like to step you through, and some of you have heard this before, some others not, is sort of our process that we went through to start the process of developing the model, the transportation travel demand model. Basically, it's morphing our travel demand model into something that we could actually use for this project, and then looking at the criteria that we use for prioritizing and looking at site selection, how we actually, select sites out of all the sites that we modeled for flood impacts, and then reviewing the maps and the data that actually comes out of that process, and looking at how the maps were formulated, how they're displayed, how you can work with them. We actually have provided links online to actually use those maps. So I think I'd like to hand it over to Christian. And then we'll have Dave Walker speak a little bit about the prioritization methodology, and then Christian will come back and we'll review the web maps. So we can mute everybody, but if you want to self-mute, that's fine. We just wanted to give the presenters some room to do their presentations. So don't forget that you can use the chat box as we move forward. And if you have any questions, I'll be monitoring the chat box. So I guess we'll take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Julie. All right. Let's see. Can anyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah,
we
I
can
can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. And if we go into, how's that for presenting?
Looks good.
That's good. All right, perfect. Let me hide you all. All right, everyone. So as Julie said, we're going to talk about the travel demand model methodology. For some of you, this is going to be a refresher multiple times. For some of you, this is a first time thing. I cannot see the chat box. So if you do have a question, I just ask you to please put it in there. Maybe Julie or Dave, if it's appropriate to bring up right away, just feel free to interrupt me.
Yep, I'll monitor the chat box.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Sure.
All right, so as Julie said, we're going to kind of take two steps here. We're going to review the travel demand model, how we used it, and then we're also going to look at some of the web maps that we developed that Julie had sent out links for. Again, if you haven't had a chance to look at those, please do. You'll be able to pan, zoom, scroll, and kind of focus really on where you're interested in looking. So we first wanted to talk about Rockingham Planning Commission's travel demand model. So this is a model that we use for our transportation planning purposes. This is actually a model that we developed in combination with Stratford Regional Planning Commission. So it covers both of those regions. This is what you call a 4-step travel demand model. So in step 1, we use a variety of socioeconomic and demographic data to generate daily vehicle trip numbers. For example, if someone's going from their home to their work to their home, those can be trips. We then use transportation analysis zones and attributes inside of those, such as where people live, the locations of employers, to actually say how many trips we think are going to be going to those zones. We then go to the 3rd step, which is a mode choice to basically say, hey, how are people going to take their trip? Is it going to be by auto, walking, or transit? And then lastly, the model determines the most efficient trip route to get from an origin to a destination. And this is an iterative process that's constantly updating and adjusting to really find the most efficient routes. So what this model allows us to do is quantify how many vehicles are on specific road segments and allow you to actually change the model network to simulate sea level rise or new transportation projects that might change the capacity of certain roads or add in new lanes. And we'll be able to see how the model simulates changes in driver, walker, transit behavior. So here is our model area. In the middle slide, you can see here, again, it covers the municipalities of Stratford Regional Planning Commission, Rockingham Planning Commission. For our purpose here is the study area for the STCVA project. And within that area, you can see all of the massive network that we have. So these, as you can see on the left here, includes all different types of roads by functional class. And you'll see I put a star next to local roads. So our travel demand model can't accurately model every single road and behavior. It's just not possible at that granularity. So we have to bump it up, which means that we have to remove a number of roads. And what you're seeing is mostly it's state-owned roads. There are a number of local roads, but it's not every single local road. And it's important to note that just because, as you can see, if we don't have every road, we don't have every single alternate path. So when we talk about impacted segments due to sea level rise, we might be shifting traffic to a different road than someone might actually take. For example, if there's an alley shortcut that someone might want to use instead of getting onto a state route, we can't capture that completely. So again, this is a simulation. It's doing the best we can. But again, it doesn't have every single local road, and you can see that network there. So how do we actually do this? So we utilize the sea level rise scenario digital elevation models created through the Sea Rise and Tides to Storm projects. And they basically estimate the impacts of rising sea levels on the landscape. For this project, we use the 1 foot, 1.7, 4 foot, and 6.3 foot sea level rise scenarios for this analysis. So what we can do is bring our model network that I just showed you, and actually the model network is going to be for the whole model. So we can actually start to see if there's impacts outside of just our study area. We can bring that model network and our digital elevation models into our GIS software, and we can start to see, hey, where are we expecting impacts? So for example, this is a segment, this is Marsh Road in Rye, and at 1 foot sea level rise, we're actually starting to see due to the sea level rise, we're starting to see that this road is actually going to be impacted. So we're able to see all the road segments and exactly where we can see impacts at those 4 different scenarios. Then we can run it through our model. This is just a software. It takes a couple hours to run depending on each scenario. And we've done this for each and every of those four scenarios. We can't exactly close off roads completely. This is due to the trip distribution. If you have too many broken links or impacted links, it just won't run. And we're going to bring that up later, actually. So instead of completely turning off links, we just set vehicle capacities very, very low and very, very low speed limits. We're talking probably 25 vehicles a day going 1 mile an hour. So really the model's not sending vehicles on these routes, but we have to have them open. And so what we get are a lot of results. As you can see here in this chart, we can actually see, you know, what our predicted volumes are, our auto, our predicted trucks, for every single one of our segments in our network. And so just to go back to kind of what the GIS data looks like when we compare the network with our sea level rise scenario, we can actually see how many impacted road miles we have. So at our 1 foot scenario, we're talking about half a mile, 1.7, 1 mile. It's really at the 4 foot scenario where we start to see major impacts. And in the web maps, you'll be able to see that a little bit better. At 6.3 foot of sea level rise, we're actually almost doubling that, 33.2. And so what I wanted to mention before was just that in the 6.3 foot scenario, as hard as we tried, we actually could not run the travel demand model scenario for 6.3 feet of sea level rise. There are just too many impacted links to actually even run the model. And so this is just important to note. You're gonna, you know, it's huge swaths of our model area are just impacted and unable to be utilized at this level. So now we're going to jump into the web maps. And let me change my sharing. So can you all see this web map?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. So this is, you know, it's typical like Google Maps. This is an interface. You can pan, you can zoom, you can scroll, but we're going to start zoomed out really far. So our inundated roads, those are just roads. This is our 1 foot sea level rise scenario that are going to be impacted at sea level rise. So as you can see here, here's that marsh road. So we can see it looks like, you know, maybe some overtopping of a road is predicted to happen here when those sea levels rise. So this is kind of like your base map. You're able to see, you know, where we're expecting sea levels to rise, what we're expecting to be inundated. The other thing with the model I had mentioned was that we can actually see changes and see, you know, how traffic volumes are changing and shifting. So if we go to this layers button up here, we've got a number of different layers. So we can look at, well, how about volumes? If we want to see volume differences, we'll start with the daily volumes. So if we go back to our legend, we can see here, you know, our red segments, they have about over 10,000 vehicles a day, down to our yellow segments, which are about 1,000 vehicles a day. So if we look at Marsh Road, we can turn off. So we know that Marsh Road right now is getting under 1,000 vehicles a day. But at 1 foot sea level rise, we're predicting it to lose a significant amount of volume. But it's not really showing up just because the numbers are so small. So let's actually look at the percent change instead. And this is where we can see that actually on Marsh Road, there's going to be no volume. And this makes sense just because no one can travel on there anyways. But what you're seeing is when people can't travel on Marsh Road because it's inundated, you're actually seeing traffic volumes change. So our model is predicting that instead people probably headed south and north can't take Marsh Road. They're actually going to redirect going around here, and we're actually going to start to see volume increases on these southern roads here. And when we zoom out and start to look in other places, we can start to see other impacts as well on where we can see traffic decreasing because High Street is going to be impacted by sea level rise. We can start to see North Shore Road is going to have increased volumes. Same thing south of here. And in downtown as well. So these maps really allow you to see what we're actually, what our model is simulating, what our model is predicting. So let's see what happens at the 1.7 foot sea level rise. Again, we're only talking about half a mile more, we think, of actually impacted roads. So again, if we go into Marsh Road, we actually see a little bit more of Marsh. Now we've got Parsons slightly impacted. But again, we're kind of looking at those same three areas. Where you really start to see the impact is actually at our 4 feet of sea level rise. At 4 feet, we probably have 125 different road segments that are going to be impacted. And I'll just slowly kind of scroll up and down the seaboard. You can actually
Christian,
also
could you kind of point out where Route 1A is on your map?
Yep. So Route 1A is kind of running up and down here. And actually you can see many sections of Route 1A are predicted to be impacted by sea level rise.
And you're heading north right now, right?
Yep, I'm headed north right now. Again, this is at 4 feet of sea level rise. Large swaths of 1A. Parts of 1B, 2, parts of downtown Portsmouth. This is Squamscott Road out in Greenland. We've got parts of Exeter. And so if we go to that percent change map, this is where we start to see. So again, this is how volumes are changing. So red is, we're seeing an increase of greater than 50%. Blue is a decrease of basically nothing. And it's nothing because you can't travel on those roads if they're impacted. So we're seeing lots of traffic move off of 1A on the coast, moving inland. And again, if you want to take the time to view these web maps yourself, you can actually kind of click. You can click on each link. You can see the name of the road, what town it is, the 2015 base volume. It's just the base volume for 2015. For every single segment, you'll see that same thing. This is the volume at 4 feet of sea level rise and the percent volume change. So you can see that this bracket road, again, kind of inland off 1A, we're actually expecting traffic volumes to increase here. So then people can travel.
Hey, Christian, the question. So those volumes that you just brought up in that table, are those average daily volumes?
Yep, those are average daily volumes.
And this is Dave. I'll just add to those are the model baseline models numbers. They may not reflect what is actually on the road in reality because the model does assign traffic region wide and it doesn't fully follow what you might find on the ground. We do calibrate it to ground counts. So we try to make it as accurate as possible, but there will be some differences between what a actual traffic count might show you and what the model is going to spit out. And for that reason, that's why we're looking more at the percentage changes, because then you can apply that to actual ground counts, or you can apply it to model volumes to get the differences and to see how that might impact exactly how much traffic is out there.
And so it would not capture increased volume during like seasonal. So during the summer, for example, the counts may be quite a bit higher than the average volume.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this does use an average annualized daily volume as a baseline. And so that's taking, it basically takes those peak season counts and averages them over the course of a year so that you aren't looking at your peak, you're looking at what the average traffic is over the course of the year. But that being said, you could take these percentage changes and apply them to a peak volume and see what the impact might be. Because yeah, I mean, in this case, summer traffic would be substantially higher than what you might see in November or December. And that would have a big impact on the number of cars that are being redistributed around the network.
Absolutely. Thanks for the clarification, everyone.
Sure, thanks.
So I hope this shows you that, all of our model results, we want to share them with you. We want these to be publicized. We've hopefully made them in these web maps that are pretty easy access. We hope that you all have a slight understanding of how the model works. Julie, Dave, were there any questions in the chat box?
Not that I've seen, no.
Okay, perfect. Well, if there's no more questions, I will hand it off to Dave, who's going to talk about the prioritization of sites. So one sec as I get that loaded up. All right, Dave, and I'll just let me know when to click OK and move forward.
All right, yeah. Oh, no, I'm not muted. I thought I had muted myself again. Okay, yeah. So yeah, Christian is running this presentation, so I'll have to ask him to move forward on the slides as we go. I'm just going to kind of quickly go through how we're working on the prioritization of those sites that you see that are inundated. First we use the travel demand model to help identify both the locations as well as the how traffic is going to be redistributed around the region based on the impacts. But the next step for us to do was to take those areas that are estimated to be impacted and figure out how to identify which ones should be the highest priorities for addressing first. And so we've set up a process, a sort of a 4-phase kind of process for doing that. And basically that will take us from the total number of sites down to sort of a select few that we can do a sort of a detailed analysis on as we step through this. Christian, could you move to the next slide? So, oh, well, I just sort of went through that. In the site selection criteria, we looked at 8 different pieces of this, and one of them isn't listed here, and that's, I'll talk about that a little bit. That's the sort of the local input side of it, and that's something we're going to get going forward. So there are 7 real pieces that we've used in this first phase of our prioritization process. And really how it breaks down is about a couple of operational considerations, some health and safety factors, and some socioeconomic factors. And we've set those out, defined them, and weighted them, and applied the scores to each of the locations in the model that are impacted. And so I'm going to step through what each of these are, and then very quickly, and then show how we're weighting those criterion at the end. Next slide, please. So one of the criterion is alternate routes. So we're looking using the GIS data, and so this is not using the model data. This is using the GIS data to identify if a particular link has an alternate route to get to and from adjacent links in the scenario. So a good example of a link that might be considered not having a good alternate route would be, say, the access points onto Newcastle and that island. And so we had a small number of links that have alternate or don't have alternate routes. About 20 out of the 125 links don't have an alternate route, which means there's no other way to get there than using that particular link. So that was one of our considerations. And in this case, because it was sort of a yes or no answer, a link that has no alternate route sort of got a high score, whereas if the link does have an alternate route, it got no score for that.
Oops, sorry about that. I was trying to click the next button.
It's all right. All right, so traffic volume, this was an operational consideration. and we used the numbers from the travel demand model here to get the identified volumes, but we also supplemented that by looking at ground counts on those links, that if we had that data available, or on adjacent links if it was somewhere close by. And so we categorized the links into sort of a equal distribution of volumes, and tried to split things out that way, so that we were trying to get an equal distribution across the 125 links and so that our scoring could be split out that way. And so those links with the highest volumes got the highest score, of course, and those links with the lowest volumes got the lowest score. Next slide, please, Christian.
Yep. Hey, Dave, and just one thing to add. So that we're really only scoring the inundated links. We didn't want to score our inundated links, which are mostly on the Seacoast, against the volume of I-95. So while the I-95 picture is there, it's more just to get you thinking about different roads and different road types have different volumes, but we're not trying to compare things to non-inundated links. We're only comparing inundated links to other links to try to make this a more accurate comparison.
Right. Thank you, Christian. Yeah. So for all the scoring, we really, while each of the links in the model has this information applied to it, we're really only scoring those links that are impacted by the sea level rise, or estimated to be impacted under sea level rise. So just to try to limit the numbers. If we were looking at all the links in the model, there would be a much greater variety under traffic volumes in this case. But also we'd be looking at, somewhere on the order of 3,000 links, and that's a little bit too much and unnecessary. So, all right, if we move to the next slide, assess property value. This is a socioeconomic consideration. So we looked at the value per acre of property along these links, and averaged that across for each area, and came up with a score for that. Again, we tried to ensure that we sort of had an equal distribution of links into each category to try to get some separation in the scores. And as you can see, it ranges from very low value properties, relatively speaking, at $0 to $234,000 per acre, to much higher value properties between $3 and about $6.7 million per acre.
Dave, does that include state properties too, or just the municipal property, or just private property?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can jump here, Julie. Hey, it's just the it does include municipal property. It's any value that is in the state's assessing database, which does include those municipal values.
Okay.
All right. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, so distance to emergency facilities. This is a health and safety factor that we looked at. So we looked at taking the distance from each individual link to nearby police and fire, or hospital facilities, medical facilities and things like that, and calculated the shortest path to try to get an estimate as to which locations are closest or furthest away, relatively speaking, from these emergency facilities. And so those that were where an emergency facility was either on the link or very close to it received the higher score, whereas those that were further away from the emergency facilities received a lower score. And again, we tried to get a equal distribution across all scoring categories here. Okay, distance community facilities. This is another socioeconomic factor. This is looking at the distance from the individual links to things like town libraries or town halls, park facilities, anything that might be considered a community facility that's not related to a safety issue. And again, similar to the emergency facilities piece, those links where a facility was either on or very close to it received a higher score, and those further away received a lower score. And given the sort of broader distribution of these community facilities around the region, things ended up in general much closer, with the sort of the furthest being, just over 1.5 miles away. And again, we attempted to get a equal distribution amongst the 5 categories here to broaden the scoring. Functional classification, this is an operational consideration. This is looking at the federal functional classification of roads, which is based on the function of the roadway as opposed to the ownership of the roadway or maintenance of the roadway. Things like interstate freeway links, much higher volume, form a different function from those low, local streets and minor collectors where they're expected to be much lower volumes of traffic and serving much more localized traffic versus more regional or interregional traffic. And so this is an area that we couldn't get an equal distribution because the roads are classified primarily, in this case, minor arterials or major collectors. And the difference between those is really, again, the type of function that they serve. A minor arterial is really focused on moving traffic probably between communities, whereas a major collector is probably moving traffic within a community and connecting to those minor arterials and the higher level streets. There are also a few principal arterials. That's things like, probably parts of Route 1 are considered principal arterials in this case. So, and then low capacity ramps, these are, in this case, that is something like a slip ramp for an intersection. And it's not like an interstate ramp in this case. The high capacity ramp would be an interstate ramp. Scoring wise, so we had to just make this distribution a little bit different. So those highest functional class roadways, get the highest score, and lowest class roadways receive the lowest score. And I see that Joe has asked the question, is there much of a difference in the traffic and functional categories? They're very similar. They do, sort of represent similar things in that those links with the higher volumes tend to be those with the higher functional classification. So it is somewhat measuring a very similar thing. Social vulnerability index. This is a socioeconomic factor. It's an aggregate value that takes and looks using census data. It looks at the vulnerable populations in a particular area, and such as elderly or children or disabled folks. And then it creates this value that indicate whether there's more or fewer population of those vulnerable people in an area. As a general whole, there's not a lot of vulnerable population on the Seacoast here in New Hampshire. And so our values tend to be lower for the most part. The highest value in this case for the index would be a 1. So our highest value in the region is a 0.79. And you'll notice that the number of links that this is related to, it's not equally distributed here either. And that's because in this case, we're applying an area value to a link. So there are often multiple links for one particular area value because the social vulnerability index is assigned at a census tract level or a census block level, and that incorporates many links on the model. And so we weren't able to get that equal distribution. But that being said, we're working with what we have. And so those areas that have the highest sort of social vulnerability index score would receive the highest score in here, meaning that they would be a higher priority to address.
Dave, can I just go back to, Dave, can we go back to the previous slide? Yeah.
Sure.
Just a question. So As we go through the scoring, this is sort of like the base scoring to kind of do a very broad, selection of sites across the Seacoast. But once we've selected our sites, we probably will delve back into this data to see. So for example, if we select a site where we strongly know that there's a very high social, SVI score, we'll take that into consideration, and certainly it will be a criteria with respect to how we respond to the flooding in that area. So it's not like we just do this and it's gone. This is going to live in the background, and we will definitely come back and review this information on a site-specific basis once we start to whittle down our sites from the first cut to our final sites that we look at in greater detail. Just wanted to let you guys know that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Julie. Yeah. I mean, this is, as Julie said, this is a first cut. This is just to get a sense of some sort of prioritization. And we'll be going back through on the sort of follow-up phases of this to sort of refine that and narrow our numbers down to those few sites that we're going to be able to do sort of a real detailed analysis on. Okay, we talked about the social vulnerability index. So we take each of those criterion and we assign a weight to that to sort of come up with a sort of composite score for each site. And then from that composite score, we can get, at least a first blush look at what might be a prioritization. And so, as I said, we broke it into sort of operational considerations, health and safety factors, and socioeconomic factors. And the weighting, as we've set it right now, is about 40% on operational considerations like the functional class and traffic, 30% on those health and safety factors, and 30% on the socioeconomic factors such as the SVI or community facilities and the land value per acre. So that's our current weighting as we've set it right now. This is something that can be adjusted as we move forward, and if we find that some particular scoring isn't working or there needs to be an emphasis in a different area. But the goal, the intent of this was to sort of focus on operations to really understand, how each segment is important operationally in the region. And then the other piece that we need to add into this is that sort of local input component. And that's something that we haven't included in the score, but will be incorporated. If a community has particular issues or a more detailed understanding of why a particular roadway might be more critical to them, than it might have shown up with on the scoring so far, we want to be able to incorporate that into the process, and we'll be doing that going forward, looking at our next phases of work. As we try to narrow these, what has turned out to be, Christian, can you move to the next slide? So we basically have knocked these down into 24 locations on the Seacoast, and these are some of these are individual streets that are impacted, and some of these are groups of streets that are immediately adjacent to one another or connected links. This grouping that you see, these numbering on the side, this is not the prioritization. This is just an assigned number just to help keep the grouping straight. And they move roughly from north to south, except when we get, well, roughly, I guess. And until we go down the 1A corridor, and then we incorporate the impacts onto Route 1 down at Group 22, and then outside of the coastal area in Exeter and Stratham on Water Street and Squamscott Road there as the last two groups in the list. But what it is we took those 125 links that we identified, and we sort of grouped them together because what we found is that in many cases, an area that is impacted by sea level rise, it's not just one link in the model, but it might be 4 or 5 links or 10 links that are adjacent to one another that are actually impacted. So we just we decided that it would be better to group them into sort of a manageable number. And so in the end, that turned out to be 24 groups as opposed to 125 individual links. So, Christian, are you going to show the web maps now?
Yep. Yep. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think we're at the point, unless maybe there are any further questions. Trying to look at the participants list here, make sure nobody's got their hands raised. Nope, no questions so far. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat box either, so.
Perfect. So again, we have another web map here, same interface. And what this will let you do is kind of explore those groups that Dave were talking about. For example, you can see here, this is our group 15, Lock Road and 1A. Again, these were a number of individual segments, but with their location and where they were, we really created a different group for them. So what you can do is go around, you can look at all of the groups, and you can also see some of the scores and how they turned out as well. Different scores and values. So we'd urge you to take a look, see here. I think our Squamscott Road is a little gray, so that one, just keep a note for that. It does still exist there. But all these web maps, Julie, again, had sent out a link. Should be able to access them. If you have any questions on how to use them or anything, her little description was helpful. But if you need anything specifically on these, let me know. I'd be more than happy to help. And if we don't have any final questions, Julie, I think we can toss it back to you.
Thanks. Sorry, I was just giving my dog a snack. She was getting a little restless. Great. Well, thanks so much. And so we kind of wanted to open it up to folks in the audience. If you have any questions, I'm going to look at the participants list here. I'm going to close the chat. So if you want to use the raise hand function, say when everyone know how to do that. Actually, don't see it here on my list.
Well, we also have, I think, a small enough group here that if somebody has a particular comment, they can wave their hand or just start talking, I guess.
Yeah. So Dave, if we just unmute the folks who are on the call.
Well, I can ask them all to unmute. I think they actually have to do that themselves, but.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yeah. So if you have a comment that you want to make, just I would say unmute yourself and have at it.
So if there aren't any questions about the presentations, we sort of wanted to open it up to the local folks, municipal representatives and others to sort of take some notes and, for you to have time to voice some concerns, or, I had thrown out some questions to think about, in advance of the meeting and after the presentations. And if there are any, local issues of concern, whether it's a site-specific issue or a general issue, a traffic flow issue, any sort of issue related to flooding that disrupts either commerce or just general, transportation function. And also asked too, and the last question I had posed was, how many communities have actually incorporated some of this information, flood-related considerations into their zoning or their land use regulations as a result of sort of working through either the Tides to Storms project or the coastal risk and the Seacoast project. So Bob, I'm going to put you on the spot. If you're still there, it looks like you might be frozen. No, I don't think he's.
Yeah, I think he's frozen.
Yeah. Or anybody else on the call, coastal program staff or DOT staff, you have any specific comments about, where we're at with respect to the project. We're moving into the phase where we have the 25 sort of, draft sites, and we're looking at trying to hone them down into something more manageable from a more in-depth analysis standpoint. And so we've asked Jennifer Jacobs and Joe Sias from UNH to kind of look at those sites. They've been pouring through the maps and looking at the web maps and looking at the sites. And I think our next phase is to have a meeting with them to kind of look at, get their feedback from where they think we should what areas we should focus on. And that meeting will also include Department of Transportation staff as well, to get their perspectives on what kind of management they currently do on certain sites, and if there's any site they would like us to look at specifically in any greater detail for adaptation or resilience options. So that's kind of our next phase, is to kind of whittle down to focus on about maybe anywhere between 6 to 10 sites. What we're looking at trying to do is not only selecting the sites that are most impacted, but also trying to get a nice cross-section of different types of sites. So sites that involve, sites that potentially involve natural resource impacts like salt marsh and things. Some that involve only roadway improvements like, elevating roads, and others that are more infrastructure, focused with respect to rehabbing, drainage infrastructure like culverts, bridges, and major structural modification. So we're trying to get a nice cross section. And what we're trying to do also is to try and, out of the 25 sites, is to try and select the candidate sites, what we're calling them, and group them such that we can translate, the methodology. So for example, if it's just a roadway elevation project, that can translate to many different sites within that larger group of 25. And if it's a site that requires major modification or impacts to natural resources, whether it's a natural shoreline or a salt marsh or sensitive habitat, that the methodology can translate to other sites within that larger group of 25. So that's kind of how we're trying to use the candidate sites, the smaller number, to try and again have a sort of a model to use to translate to other portions of the transportation network. But we certainly would like to have.
Julie, if you want to have a discussion.
Sure, absolutely.
I wonder if it makes sense to take a look at the maps in the context of like the 3 sort of stakeholder areas that are present on the call. So maybe like what's up, what does it mean for Greenland? What does it mean for Northampton? And then what does it mean for kind of state roads, since those are the folks that are here, just to be able to focus in on those. And maybe Bob and William and Matt would have some thoughts on that if we zoom in a little. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. You kind of cut out there a couple times for me. I wasn't sure if I heard everything.
I'll try my headphones, but basically
That's okay.
Is that better?
Yeah.
I was suggesting that we focus on Northampton for a minute, and then focus on Greenland for a minute, and then focus on DOT roads, so that we can, really look at what the traffic demand model says for those communities. Like maybe Greenland gets a ton more traffic than they would have expected, and what does that mean for Matt and how he's thinking about planning in the town, and what the implications are in Northampton for around Philbrook Pond or something like that. If we zoom into those specific areas on this call, since they're on the call, that might be a valuable way to have some conversation. Did you hear me that time?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. And so it looks like Christian is queuing up the web maps to do what you just talked about. So if Bob, if you'd like to comment at all, Bob Landman, about any places specifically in Northampton that are of interest to the town?
Well, one thing we thought of was to have there should be signage saying, in the event of sea level rise, this road is unpassable. You look on TV and you see them driving through, water's up to the wheel well and they're just splashing through it. There should be a warning to the public about these critical roads.
You know, it's a really interesting comment because if you've been over to Brown's Seafood down in Seabrook, they're right on off of 108, right on the marsh. They actually install signs just like that at the edge of their parking lot in the areas that actually flood during highest and unusual high tides. It says, you know, flood risk area, you know, kind of thing. So yeah, I think signage could go a long way towards, and I've seen that in different parts of the country where it does say, you know, this road subject to flooding. So I think that's a really great point.
You can see it up at the restaurant up in Portsmouth, the one on Route 1, that the parking lot always floods. Even now at high tide.
Rathskeller. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Rathskeller. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a poster child for flood impacts. Yeah. Anything else in Northampton?
No, I not yet. I'm new to this. Mike Tully tapped me to do this. I wrote it back and I said, has anybody been appointed to do this? I didn't get a reply, so that I would get it. So, this is brand new to me.
We're happy to have you on board.
We're
happy to have you on board.
I'm happy to be on the board.
Well, you know a lot about Northampton, so that's exactly the kind what we want. We want local knowledge. So.
Right.
So Matt Scruton, are you still on the call from Greenland?
Yeah, hi, Julie.
Hey.
I have no questions right now. Obviously, for traffic impact, would be most concerned, I think, with 33.
Okay.
In addition to 195, but.
Actually, I have a question for you because you are one of the more inland communities, and this is just sort of like a anecdotal, you know, observation from my standpoint as someone who's lived in the Seacoast for a long time. And we all know when summer comes around, I mean, I know when I'm coming from, I don't jump on 95 to go north. I just don't in the summertime just because it's such a nightmare. I know exactly where, you know, the side roads to take and the back roads to go on. And do you see an influx of more local traffic on your local roads in the summer, people diverting off of, you know, coming down Post Road and, you know, trying to get away from 95 and, you know, hopping onto 33 as you know, close to Portsmouth as they possibly can?
Yes, absolutely. Especially now with the phone apps, people have like, what is it, Waze? People get diverted.
Waze, yeah.
Even people that aren't familiar with the area get diverted onto the secondary roads, which puts an impact on those roads.
Well, I guess I kind of see it as sort of like a, I guess a comparison of what would happen if a lot of the major arteries or the major, you know, roads were impacted such that people were making those diversions on a regular basis. How much more traffic you would see in your town. I guess I was just trying to make a comparison between what we see now versus what could be a more frequent occurrence, not just during the summer months.
Well, we see Dave Walker will remember this. A few years ago, I asked for a road study on Post Road. I live on Post Road, and I'm amazed at the traffic, the trucks that come through here regularly, diverting from the tolls, maybe whatever. It's been a couple of years since we did that, David, but there's a fair amount of traffic always on Post Road, and we had this terrible accident up the street at 111 where we had a fatality the other day. That intersection is just horrible, but you know, it's by the church and you know, there's no good solution. It's meant for horses.
Well, yeah, it's one of my favorite diversions, actually. I take Post Road as much as I can to get away from, you know, the traffic on 33 personally. Plus it's a nice scenic road. But anyway, just kind of like trying to like capture some evidence like that of, you know, already what we see for diversions of traffic because for other reasons, but what would happen if we saw those on a more frequent basis because of flooding. And that's what we're hoping to be able to show that in a more tangible way based on the flooding maps that Christian and Dave had presented. That this may happen, like if we get flooding twice a month, it might happen twice a month, you know, every month, every year kind of thing, or even more frequently than that. So,
I mean, Northampton always has flooding on 1A. We've had problems with it forever. I don't think it's all been cured either. We improved at 111 where it comes into 1A. There's the drainage from the marsh was not big enough, and the Corps of Engineers came in and improved it. But we still have flooding there. So
Right.
it's so low.
Any other comments from Bob or Matt right now about any concerns or reflections? I know this is a lot to take in an hour in a 2-hour meeting, so I understand that it can be a little overwhelming to like internalize all this stuff. But what we'd like to do is urge you all to take advantage of the web map links and go back in and look at the web maps in a little bit more detail. And we're going to follow up this meeting with a survey to municipalities and asking them some more very specific and pointed questions, similar to the ones I sent out with the email the other day.
I'm going to have John Hudson, our road agent. He's not involved, but he should be, and he's the guy that's, I'll find out from him what he sees.
John Hudson?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just jotting his name down. If he's not on, if he wasn't on the invite list, then he will be.
He should be.
Yeah, we like road agents to be on these parts of these discussions for sure. So if there are any more questions from Bob and Matt, then I guess maybe we'll ask if William Rose would like to, if he's on the call still, if he has any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to add to the discussion.
Thanks, Julie. I guess have we gotten a link to the web map stuff?
Yeah, I sent it in the first, I think the second email that I sent, which was earlier this week. I can resend it. Of course, I can resend it to the entire group actually with the web map links. So these maps that Christian showed are on it, and also the 20. There's a fourth map of the 25 prioritized sites that's also an add-on. So I'll resend the links.
Appreciate that.
There's just a lot. Pardon?
I was just saying I appreciate that.
Sure. There's a lot to unpack, and I know when we first presented these to the coastal program, they took some time to go through, and also our UNH partners, Jennifer and Joe. There's a lot to unpack when you start looking at these. I mean, we're looking right now at an image of the entire Seacoast, and you start delving into these and really, honing in on certain sites and stuff in very specific areas, especially those that we all know that are typical, flood areas of flooding that we see now. Especially when you start to look at, the differences between like the 1.7 foot sea level rise scenario and the 4 foot scenario. It's pretty striking, just, how much more impact there is when you raise sea level by 2 feet. And you start to look at, and you can see in the roadway network, it's kind of really shocking in a lot of ways, even from someone like me who knows the Seacoast pretty well, and I navigate the Seacoast frequently, how few alternative routes there are to get from point A to point B, especially when you're trying to go east from the east to the west. So if you're trying to get off of Route 1A, away from an area that's flooding, you have very few alternatives to actually do that, especially through Rye and Northampton. There just aren't a lot of interior roads. So the choices are limited. When you get down to Hampton, it's a little bit more of a denser, local road network. There are older subdivisions and ways you can kind of cut through and get from, get around. But it starts to be really apparent when you start to look at some of these areas that the choices and the alternatives are quite limited. So that's one thing when you start, kind of mining these maps, is to pay attention to that part of it. Not only just how difficult it may be to go, north to south, but if you needed to make a diversion, especially if you're a resident, and there are some areas, especially in Rye, and there's one in Northampton where there are these neighborhoods that become, based on the flood projections here, of roadway impact, that become isolated. You can't get out. I mean, there's just nowhere for you to go. They become little islands and they become very isolated. So there's some really interesting, and this information all came out in our Tides to Storms, project that we worked on with the towns, and it was of a lot of concern to them, like where are, so if we can't travel this roadway, where do we go? Where does traffic go? So just some food for thought when you start to, explore the web maps a little bit.
It wouldn't hurt to have signage that said, that the alternate is to go this road or another road. Rye's difficult because it's such a mess. I get lost there all the time without GPS.
Well, and Rye's, and the thing that came out of our Tides to Storms project, and Bob, you bring up a really good point, and that is that every town is very different from one another. Northampton tends to be higher and drier just generally. Rye has incredible amounts of salt in interior tidal waterways that go really far in away from the coast. And that's why there's so few roads, because there's just no way to put roads in those areas. It's never been developed because it's tidal waterway or a salt marsh. So every town has a little bit of a different signature and a little bit of a different, set of problems. And Kirsten's raising her hand to make a comment or question.
Yeah, I had a question that maybe is for Jennifer and Joe. As you're looking at some of these segments that are vulnerable at 1 foot of sea level rise, which to me indicates that they definitely are going to be inundated daily in the not too distant future. And is there going to be some sort of criteria for and maybe we can get into this a little more when I talk about the coastal flood risk guidance and the alternatives analysis, but I imagine there might be some situations where the alternatives you come up with are cost prohibitive or maybe not feasible for other reasons. And so is there going to be like a threshold where you actually sort of come up with the recommendation that the road be decommissioned under some situations, or is that not in the scope of kind of this next step of the project?
Jennifer had to jump off, so I think Joe is still on, but I think she's only on by phone. Not sure she's here.
You could probably.
I guess I could respond to your question, because I think it's almost like a two-parter. So Dave and Christian and I were just talking about this the other day, and that our assumption is moving forward with selecting our priority sites, that automatically the sites that are inundated at 1.7 feet of sea level rise will be on the short list, because if they're already getting flooded, well, then it's only going to get worse over time. So it makes sense to put those on the priority list for looking at adaptation and resilience. So thinking about that and keeping that in mind, and that the short term of 1.7 feet of sea level rise, if anything, so those would probably be areas where projects would be proposed to do some infrastructure improvements, right, roadway improvements there. And so it makes all the sense in the world to not just plan for 1.7 feet, but plan for 4 feet, because eventually it's going to be a more exacerbated situation, and more flooding is going to occur. So why not, if you're going to do something significant and you're going to invest in a certain location, it's going to get worse, than just plan to the higher scenario. And so I think that given that sort of decision tree sort of thing, if we get to thinking about, so what would the site look like if we had to modify it to accommodate 4 feet of sea level rise? Gets to your point, Kirsten, I think. It's is it possible to even do it? I think in some locations where you're talking about where the only modification that's necessary is to elevate the road, is it even possible to elevate the road to accommodate 4 feet? I mean, because you're going to disconnect everything around it, whether it's a local access or a driveway or whatever it ends up being. You could potentially put large culverts or a bridge in there, but what does that do to everything else that connects to it? So is it even possible to make the modification? So your question is like right in line with the kinds of conversations we're going to have with our UNH team and the DOT about what's actually, feasible.
Okay.
Does it, and I think that if you go that far down the line in sort of like, the analysis component, and you find that at 4 feet, it's just not possible anymore, then you kind of backtrack and you say, okay, we'll improve it to 1.7 feet and give it some life, but then eventually it may have to just go away. I mean, you know what I'm saying about that kind of back
sort of
and forth
buy some time.
decision-making process, right? And so I think that's definitely going to be part of sort of the recommendations that come out of the project.
Okay.
Did that answer your question? In
Yeah,
lieu of
yeah.
them not being here.
Thanks.
Okay.
Not an easy question, so.
No, it's not.
One other question that came to mind for me was whether there's a plan to obtain similar input from the other communities that couldn't participate today on the results.
Yes. So we didn't know how many people would participate today. So it was disappointing that more people weren't here. I understand, everyone's super busy, but we're going to follow it up with a survey, I think, and try and get, mine some information about local decisions. Even if it's not as specific to the web maps, we may refer back to the web maps and ask them to look at something and respond to it. But I'm thinking we may actually need to convene, meetings with each of our participating towns.
Yeah.
And whether that's a video conference or what do we end up doing, but it may be more of a one-on-one type situation where we interview them basically and have a discussion very similar to what we had today. And like, Bob, like getting your road agent, John, Hudson on board and getting his input. So we may have to regroup and think about how to do that in the next couple of months to try and get some more feedback from them.
Cool. Thanks.
I'm just pausing to write myself a note here. Great. I think we're at about 2:18. I think we were planning, if anyone has any more discussion that they want to have just generally about the project or kind of where we're headed. I think our next steps are to work with the UNH team to create that priority list and get that feedback from the towns and also, meet with, hopefully convene a meeting with DOT about their site specific concerns and then kind of come up with that short list and then work on with the UNH team to develop some and DOT also to develop some adaptation and resilience strategies for each one of the sites.
Oh, Julie, did get a note from Mike Tully saying, yes, we had a phone conversation about it back in September after you said you would be willing to sit. So I'm it.
Oh, you forgot about the phone conversation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's relatively new too. Your town manager is relatively new. He hasn't been there that long, has he?
Who is it now?
Your town manager has not been.
Yeah, he was our fire chief for 25 years. And we've had turnover. Everybody, Paul Apple and all the other, we just keep going through town. They get better jobs, the last one went up to Maine, got a better job, got a rate. So, and he lives in our town, so it's perfect. He's
okay, perfect. Well, he knows then.
He's great.
He's probably the best person to actually have on a conversation and talk about some of this stuff since he's been in the trenches literally, right?
Oh yes, all emergency management things. So yeah, he's very good. I pushed for him to get the TA job, and so he took it. So he's retired basically and came back. So yeah, so between the two of us and then John Hudson, I'm surprised John didn't get on the list, but I'll talk to him and get his input. So.
Okay. And specifically to your point, Kirsten, about asking, for feedback from towns, I think what we'd like to do is probably, if we can do, is convene a meeting whether it's by video conference or however we end up doing it, of the emergency management personnel for each one of the towns, because they share so much in common, and they work together already on emergency management. So it would make sense to get them together to kind of get their collective feedback as a group, because I think their perspective is really kind of unique in the community, just because of the position they hold. And I think that their input would be, and just having like a group discussion like this for half an hour would be, I think, really productive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, emergency management, all our people are EMTs. They've got to be able to get to the customers if they've got an emergency, and police also. So we have a new police chief, lady, very nice, Christian. What's her last name? Monet. She's our chief of police, and so we should have. That would be a good idea to have. Hudson, me, Catherine, Mike Tully, and the fire and the police chief point out all the problems that they see in emergencies.
Yeah, and also, I think also, and William, are you still here on the call?
I am.
William Rose? Great. And I think one of the things that kind of came out of the DOT meeting that we had back in March, was it March or February, was actually one of the last in-person meetings that we had for this project. That came out of it was that there's a kind of a complicated relationship with respect to the DOT and the municipalities as to who, like in an emergency situation, who puts up the cones and who puts up the road closure signs and everything. That there needs maybe some discussion around that and what the protocol and the management strategies are to manage that. Do you have anything to add to that about that?
Additional conversation on that subject can't hurt.
Pardon?
An additional conversation wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so just like some more coordination around who does what and when does it happen. I know that it was interesting when the last large storm we had, it was it came up the coast, and I actually drove the coast that day because I really wanted to get out and ground truth our maps to see, are these places that I had the maps on the seat next to me. I'm like, these are the maps that say this is where it's going to flood, and sure enough, that's exactly where it happened. And kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge sort of a combination of road closure signs and everything, and when things were closed, because when I started to come back south again, things hadn't been closed and then they were closed. So it's just kind of interesting. But I think a conversation about emergency, if flooding starts to happen more frequently, then what's the response? Who's going to respond and who's going to put those signs out?
That was about a 1.4 inch rain. I've got a weather station, and I was astonished at how much rain came down that day.
Great. Well, I think maybe we'll move on ahead if no one else has any comments or questions. Kirsten's up next, and she's going to give a presentation about the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Guidance, which she and I and a whole bunch of other people worked on and Natalie also, for how long? 2 years? I think it was like 2 years,
months
right?
Or so, yeah.
18 months-ish, right? And so, a tool that may help municipalities, the DOT, and others who are working on site-specific flood-related problems to get a handle on, what the best direction to head in is. And so she'll go through. I think she's going to choose a site on the Seacoast and take us through the flood risk guidance.
Yeah. Can you all see my slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And just let me know if I start cutting out again. My laptop has a funky microphone, so sometimes it's tired.
Great shot, by the way, on the cover there. That's an incredible shot.
Yeah, it illustrates exactly what we're talking about. And incidentally, this was the winner of the King Tide photo contest from last year, and the next King Tide photo contest is coming up November 14th to the 17th. So we're expecting probably not quite this high of tides, but still at least up the side roads along Ashworth Ave, those dates. So essentially what I'm going to do is talk about kind of a next step that I think this project can take based on the 24 sites that have been identified, and how it might coordinate with the work that UNH is going to do with RPC by introducing you or reintroducing you all to the 2020 New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Guidance, which came out in March of 2020. It was part 2 of a 2-part report that we're required to update every 5 years by state law to summarize best available science we have on coastal flood risks, future coastal flood risk in particular. So part 1 just talked about science, and part 2 kind of took the science and said, this is how you should use it and how you can pick your numbers for various projects, basically. And it does that by laying out a series of 7 steps that help you start by kind of defining your project and your tolerance for flood risk. Those are the first 2 steps. And then go through a process of picking, based on those factors and your project time frame, picking your sea level rise, appropriate sea level rise numbers for that site, as well as coastal storm, groundwater rise that's caused by sea level rise, and extreme precipitation factors. And then at the end, it sort of provides a framework for how to identify some alternatives that might help you meet your project goal. So one important note to make is that those 7 steps that you walk through in the guidance document, which we have hard copies of and is also available in the link that is in these slides, so we'll share that later. But if you want a hard copy, let me know. But basically the steps are presented in sequence from 1 to 7. You kind of walk through them, but they're also, it's a very subjective process. And if you get to step 3 and decide that you wanted to make some changes to what you said in step 2, it's also very iterative. So this diagram just is intended to illustrate that you are allowed to go back to previous steps and change your answers. So in that document, in the guidance document, there's a fillable PDF form at the end. It's a worksheet that is intended to kind of help you walk through your project. I'm not going to use it today, but it is helpful, and I've used it on a number of sites that have permit applications associated with them, just to help me walk through all the steps for a site. So just know that that's there, and if you have a site in mind that you want to work through, you can certainly use it. Instead, what I'm going to do today is basically what we've decided to do is that it makes sense to take all 24 of the sites that have been prioritized in this project and kind of do a cursory walkthrough of the 7 steps in the guidance for each site. And so Tiffany, who's on the call today too, and I are going to work through that in more of a spreadsheet form, where we'll take all the sites and we'll add some columns and add some answers that that help kind of identify these numbers as we're talking about. And I think the way to think about this is that this project has used generalized sea level rise scenarios to help us understand the risk at all of the sites, and also put together priority characteristics associated with each site that help us understand their relative importance for various reasons. And then now we can pull out each individual site, and it's not necessarily the case that every one of them is going to have the same tolerance for flood risk or the same flood risk at its particular site. And so the numbers that you might want to be planning to, depending on your goals, might be different based on each site. So this exercise will kind of help us figure that out. So I thought I would start by, for today, I would just really quickly, I would use site 15, that's ranked number 15. So when Christian was walking us through the sites, this one is along Route 1A, and it circles Rye Harbor. So I think most folks are probably familiar with it. And I just sort of randomly picked that one. So it's, so I'll walk through each step and use that as an example. So the first step is define your project goal, your type and location and timeframes. The guidance has descriptions of a description of what we mean by a project. It's a very broad term in this case. So it could mean anything from a road project to a larger master planning project. And how you would apply the guidance is different based on that. But for Site 15, this is sort of what I responded with initially. So I'm going to make the assumption that our goal here is to maintain function of the this Site 15 at Lock Road and Ocean Boulevard in Rye for as long as we can. I'm also, the project is site specific. That's its type according to the guidance. And then in step 1.2, you take a look at what the area is around that site and what's important around it. So we know that, you know, this particular site, it provides critical access to Rye Harbor. It's a major collector as identified in the assessment so far. It provides access to Foss Beach. There are residences there. It's surrounded by salt marsh. It has, and I overlaid the tidal crossing data on this segment, and you can see that it has 5 culvert or bridges along it. So that gives us some understanding of the fact that it's not just a road we're talking about when it comes to enhancing it or protecting it. There's a lot of, there's tidal water crossings associated with it that are fairly significant. And then step 1.3 is where you define your time frame of interest. So this is a tricky one, I think, for this particular project in general, and one that might require some input. And I think a big question is whether we want to apply the same timeframes for every single site out of the 24, or if we want to get more specific and apply different timeframes to different sites. But for now, I just kept it somewhat general and said, let's think about the useful life of this segment out to 2100. So that's 80 years from now. Assume we want it to function until then. And then, you know, there's probably some upgrades and maintenance that need to happen between now and then. So let's also think about an incremental action point of 30 years from now. So that would be 2050. So those are the 2 timeframes I'm going to focus on for now. We could obviously change that and it would change our numbers. And that's kind of the important point. Step 2 is where you think about tolerance for flood risk. So tolerance for flood risk is a concept that allows us to be flexible when it comes to thinking about what sea level rise number you need to plan for or other flood risk numbers you need to plan for. So the concept is that it's your willingness to accept a higher amount or probability of flood risk or a lower probability of flood risk at a given site. So the way we describe it is that you would think about a hospital, for example, which is a big critical facility, very important to get to, very important for it to function, as having a very low tolerance for flood risk. It would be really bad if that hospital flooded. So we need to plan for that hospital to be for it to be very unlikely for it to flood. On the other hand, a walking path at, you know, Wagon Hill Farm in Durham, for example, or along the beach is probably going to have a high tolerance for flood risk. It's probably a little more acceptable to us if it floods because it can recover, it's not as expensive, various factors like that. So that's the basic concept. There's a table in the guidance that lays this out in a lot more detail and ties it to ASCE flood design classes. I won't go into it in too much detail, but I reference it a lot when I'm thinking about this, and it is helpful. So when I was thinking about Site 15, I thought about the fact that access to Rye Harbor, which is an economic and cultural site of importance. It also, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm assuming there might be some role for the harbor to play in an emergency situation if you know, someone needed to be rescued or something like that. There's in the prioritization process that that Dave and Christian have gone through, it's identified as having low volume, but also no alternate routes. And we saw that it has 5 culverts and bridges, so it's probably a high replacement cost if it were totally destroyed. And we also know it floods now, and that the road can probably handle a little bit of flooding. So it has a medium sensitivity to flooding. So we're okay if it gets overtopped like once in a while, we deal with that now. So all of that combined led me to decide to determine that this segment probably has a low tolerance for flood risk. Not very low, not quite as extreme as a hospital, but also not medium. And that could change if someone else were to do this and think about this differently, but for the purposes of today, we'll call it low. Now you get to step 3 and all of this ties together. So this is a table that tells us what we expect for sea level rise estimates in the future. And it varies, the numbers vary based on your tolerance for flood risk and the time frame. So when you think about, so now you take your timeframes that you've identified for your Route 15, for the site number 15, so 2100 and 2050, and then you take your tolerance for flood risk, which is low, and you just match it up in the table, and that tells us that at this site, the guidance tells us to plan for 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 5.3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And that's it. Those are the numbers. So then the next step tells you to take a look at what that looks like at the site. So I went to the sea level rise mapper and I put on 2 feet of sea level rise. And if you look, it's hard to tell in this map, but if you look closely and you play around with it, there isn't any complete overtopping under this scenario. So the road, middle of the road at least, stays dry if we have 2 feet of sea level rise and a high tide. So like, is action needed at that point? Maybe. It's a little hard to tell. These are bathtub models. You might want to do some more assessment to understand what happens with the culverts and factors like that, but it's close because the water is right up against the road along this whole segment under that scenario. Now, if we look at 6 feet, which is the closest we have to 5.3 feet mapped, and that's our 2100 timeframe, basically the entire segment is flooded at a high tide. So you would expect that to happen at least once, if not twice, every single day. And to me, that suggests that, yeah, action is probably needed along this segment in order to be able to achieve our goal that we identified for it to be functional up to 2100 between now and at that point in time. So not necessarily immediate action, but definitely action. So
hey,
that's
Kirsten, a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question on the previous slide? What sea level rise mapper did you use?
This is the link is right here. This is a mapper we put together specifically for this report. So it's the New Hampshire Sea Level Rise, Groundwater Rise, and Storm Surge Mapper. And it's just an ArcGIS online map that just has those layers on it. So it's pretty easy to use compared to the Coastal Viewer, which you could also use for this. Or, you know, another way to do this step is to go and survey. And there are a lot of different ways to tackle step 3.2. And this is just kind of the easiest one that I do if I'm looking for a quick assessment.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to stop going into quite as much detail at this point, but I'll just talk you through what the next steps do. So step 4 tells you how to think about coastal storm risk with sea level rise on top of that. So, you know, your storm today, we have all sorts of building codes and factors that we plan for and build to for today's storm. In 2050 and 2100, our flood risk is going to be significantly greater in a storm because it'll be happening on higher sea levels. What does that mean that we should be thinking about for our storm risk at those points in time? And there are ways to calculate your design flood elevation, depending on what you're building. That might be a different thing that you want to think about. But essentially, I took some info we have about Rye and their flood risk in the flood zones, FEMA flood zones in this area, to come up with an elevation you might want to make sure that you build to if you're worried about keeping things dry in a 100-year storm. And then you can map that and see what that storm looks like in this area with sea level rise as well to get a sense of the impacts. Step 5 helps you understand how groundwater rise impacts the site. So in this case, we actually have groundwater rise maps. And the point here is that with sea level rise, our groundwater levels are going to rise wherever they're close to the coast or within 3 miles of the coast, because sea level rise is going to push the groundwater levels up. So we have maps for all of the Atlantic coast communities, and you can look at them on the mapper to understand what that looks like. So this step helps you do that. And if you match it to your sea level rise scenarios that you picked earlier, so in 2050, we said 2 feet of sea level rise. I put up the map for 2 feet of sea level rise, which is not pictured here. And found that for this site, that looks like you'd expect 2.2 to 3.2 feet of groundwater rise in this whole site under that scenario. So that might be important for your road bed conditions. And Joe and Jennifer do a lot of thinking about that because they degrade more quickly if they get wet more regularly. In 2100, you'd see between 3.2 and 6.2 feet of groundwater rise at this site. The information we don't have at this site that is necessary to understand this a little better is that you need to know where your groundwater level is today. And so some more site-specific information is needed. You know, if the groundwater level is 2 feet below the surface at this site, then in 2050, you're going to start to see not only sea level rise inundation, but also surface water inundation from the groundwater pushing up under the road. So those are some additional factors to think about. And then the last step in terms of picking your numbers to plan for is the precipitation step. So we know we expect greater than a 15% increase in our precipitation in our bigger storms in the future. And so Bob, your storm of 1.4 inches, what you would add in the future, probably a 15% volume to that, if not more, depending on what scenario we end up thinking about or seeing play out. So this step just helps you figure out if you're in a situation where you're planning for a culvert or something that would need a hydrological analysis to figure out how much water to pass through, or if drainage is important, you're going to want to know your design storm, and then you're also going to want to add volume to that based on your tolerance for flood risk. So in the rise situation, it would tell us to add more than 15% volume to any design storm that's relevant to that site. And then the last step I think is where Jennifer and Joe's exercise comes in. So once we have all this information together for each site, they will have the numbers that they know they need to plan for at each site that you're choosing to develop alternatives for. And that those alternatives should be able to handle the numbers that this guidance tells you to plan for. So you can go about step 7 in any way that you choose to, but in the guidance, it lays out sort of one way to do it, which is to think about these categories of action or inaction that are available to you, and then think about, you know, what does that mean for site ranked 15 if you just take no action there? If you decide you want to avoid that area completely and prioritize investment elsewhere. So move the harbor somewhere else or something like that. Accommodate water. So if you want to continue to be there and you want to maybe allow the road to flood sometimes, or move all the houses up on stilts or something like that. Resist. So that would be building seawalls and pumps and a lot of big infrastructure to keep stuff out. And then relocate, which is, I sort of combine those two, but relocating would be kind of moving stuff out of the way and decommissioning the road. So that is step 7. And just putting this back up again, just to remind you that the thought we have is that it makes sense to take all 24 of these sites and run them through a similar exercise I just showed you, so that we have those numbers to think about at each site. But I think the biggest questions that are worth getting input on are, what is the time frame that's important for each one of these sites? What is that useful life that you want for that site? And what are some important incremental action points? And then what is the tolerance for flood risk at each one of those sites? And you know, that we could just say that it's the same for everywhere based on the fact that you've already prioritized them, and based on the fact they're all transportation infrastructure, we could choose the same timeframes everywhere, but we could also get more granular and create a little more variation. So I think that's kind of up to folks here. So if you have any questions or you want a hard copy of the guidance report, you can contact me or Natalie, who's on the call too today. And I think that is all I have for today. Any questions?
Hey, Kirsten, would you just be able to send out the URL links to the maps that you were talking about? I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Any questions from anybody on the call about the CFR guidance? The guidance is, and Kirsten, did you show a location where where it's located? We'll probably put that on the project webpage for the quarter study, where you can find the CFR guidance.
Yep, I will also share the link in the chat right now, but we can also share that link after. And I can share these slides after as well if you want to put those on the website.
Oh, can we do that? That'd be terrific. That's a great example for how to use it. Terrific. Are you planning any more instructional activities or meetings or anything like that on the guidance?
We actually have a survey out right now asking folks like the folks on this call what they want to see for more assistance and training on this. So I can also share that if anyone wants to fill it out. But we are planning to do more training.
Please send it along.
Yeah, Amanda and Lisa are going to help us with more training. It was a tough situation. We published it in March. We did record a couple of basic trainings, but no one was paying attention to anything in March since everyone had other more important priorities and still do, frankly. So we're trying to navigate that a little bit, but yeah, we will be providing more.
Sure. If you'd like to send that to me, I can send it out to the group. The email that I sent out only had the project partners in the CC line. All the municipal people went into a blind copy just because there are like 41 people, and I just didn't want to bother everybody with that amount of email stuff. So if you want to send it to me, I can send it out to the group as a follow up to this meeting. I was going to send out another email on Monday to follow up on this meeting. So yeah, that'd be great. So if you want.
Yeah, I'd like to have it. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Super.
Terrific. So watch your email on Monday, Bob. I'll be sending that around. Great. Let's see. So I think that's it for our program for today, for the meeting. That's what we wanted to cover. I think what we'd like to do is, I'll send out a follow, like I said, I'll send up a follow-up email with like next steps for the project with respect to the advisory committee, and maybe what we'd like the advisory committee to weigh in on, provide the link to the survey for the training for the CFR guidance. And I think our next steps are really to whittle down our 25 sites to a more manageable 10 or so, focus in on doing completing the CFR guidance for those sites, or at least a subset of those sites, and work with our UNH partners and DOT to have a conversation about what's feasible for each one of those sites, and come up with what we'd like to do is come up with a profile for each one of them. And then also, like I said, cross-reference them to the larger list of 25 where the methodology could be transferable to other sites, along the impacted areas. Tim, were you raising your hand? Yeah. Can't hear you. I can't hear you, Tim. Oh, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? You keep like going in mute and unmute.
I think it's not working anyway.
Can you do sign language? You could put it in the chat if you wanted to put something in the chat, if you wanted to send a message. Tim saying send the YouTube link with the email. That's, oh, yes. So yes, absolutely. Yes, so we've been recording this, and Dave's been, it's going to be uploaded to the RPC YouTube channel. So we will absolutely send that out to all the members and everyone else who was on this call, our project team members and the other municipal partners in the project. Thank you.
Just a quick comment. I've been down in the Carolinas. I have some business down there, and they're now put the homes up on stilts, put the garages underneath, and they've got, you know, emergency signs saying when it floods, get out of town, and this is the way, and this is the route that you've got to take, and don't take this one. Take, you know, it's come to that because the insurance companies have said, no, we're not going to let you rebuild unless you do this. And it's pretty startling.
It's interesting, Bob. In my windsurfing days when I lived down in Maryland, I would vacation on the Outer Banks every year.
Yeah.
And you know, the presence of flood advisory information and preparedness is just like so in your face when you go down there. I mean, it's like it becomes part of everyone's life, you know. And it's like there's signage. I mean, it's amazing the kind of signage that they have. And and all the houses except for the old timey houses are elevated, and there's emergency numbers posted in every public place that you go, even restaurants and stuff. Like there's like a plan, like if something happens when you're in this facility, this is what you need to do, kind of thing. So I totally agree that, you know, the level of preparedness and I think public knowledge of what it means to be in a flood situation is just so far advanced than here. It's just not. And I think that it's a good example of where we might need to head as a state. And Kirsten, I know you've been around coastal areas all around the country. I don't know if you've had similar experiences with seeing flood preparedness, you know, out
definitely.
in the public realm.
They're confronted with so many more hurricanes that it makes sense that they've adapted. And I guess it is like sort of comforting in a way to see that it can be done. So it's possible. I do think there is a significant difference between thinking about how to plan for that big storm every other year, or every 5 years, and thinking about how to plan for your road to be flooded every day at high tide. So even North Carolina is going to struggle with planning for that. So that is one difference that will be interesting to see if we can figure out how to handle it.
Yeah.
But I do think, Bob, like having signs in the short term and improving a lot of that communication is a great first step.
Yeah, people still think they're in the 100-year storm scenario, which the 100-year storm is not 100 years anymore.
Yeah.
I live
Or is that great? I wouldn't say it's a great story, but that story out of Marblehead where the big storm came through. Was it last year or this year? I can't remember. But anyway, they instructed people who were living down in the waterfront area to move their cars to the baseball, was it the football field or something at the high school or something like that, and they all got flooded.
Oh.
Like, yeah, you know. So I think it's about preparedness and being very aware of looking at the maps and understanding what it means, and what areas are going to be subject to flooding. Even if they're not subject to flooding now, they could flood in the future. So I mean, under these extreme circumstances, for example. Great, thanks, Bob, for that. That's a good observation.
I lived in Maryland too once upon a time, Silver Spring. So I've been.
Well, it's interesting. When I was working for the state, I was working in Annapolis, and a friend of mine who's a big, windsurfer friend. Anyway, he lived in this area near Tidewater, I think it was called, and it's on the periphery of a very low-lying area. And he didn't have flood insurance. He wasn't required to have flood insurance. But he asked me, he's like, should I be concerned about this? And so I used the preliminary mapper we had for the state, and I mapped the 500-year floodplain for him. You're not in the 100-year floodplain, but you're in the 500-year floodplain. And we've seen some big storms that have exceeded the 100-year floodplain in past years. And so I gave him the map, and he, to his credit, he went out and he got flood insurance. And sure enough, less than a year later, he got flooded because there was a 500-year storm. And he had like $35,000 worth of damage to his foundation, and he had coverage, so he was able to fix it. So, an ounce of prevention, but people asking the questions, like he was smart to ask the question, and be prepared for the consequence. So,
well, I'm a former San Franciscan. I'm prepared for everything. That's why I
Alrighty, well, I won't
left.
take up any more of your time here. That's why you left? Oh,
Yes.
oh.
One
Well,
too
I don't
many.
want to take up any more of anyone's time. It's 5 minutes to 3. We're just about, out of time, and it's a beautiful day. Hopefully people can get out and enjoy the last hour or so, hour and a half of daylight that we have. Enjoy your Friday and have a great weekend. And thanks so much for being here today. I think it was a really great, good conversation. I took lots of notes. I don't know if anyone at Coastal Program was taking notes, but did you all take notes or no? No.
I don't think any of us did. Sorry.
That's okay. Not a problem. I have a whole page of notes, so I'm good. I'm good to go. So we will follow up with an email next week. We'll provide more resources that were presented today, and follow up with a plan to do some more outreach to really key stakeholders in the municipalities, like the EMDs and the road agents. So we'll develop a plan to do that and how we'll roll that out in the next few weeks or so. So we'll keep the advisory committee advised of what we plan to do, and you'll be hearing from us soon.
Nice to see you,
And
Julie.
thank you so much, Kirsten. Yeah,
Thanks,
you too, Bob. Thanks, Kirsten, so much for participating today and giving the presentation on the guidance. And everyone else who was on the call, thank you for participating. And if you have any questions, just follow up by email if you have any questions or comments or any other information that you'd like to put forward in the meantime. So thanks everybody, and thanks Dave for being the co-pilot here and the co-host on the call. Great. Thanks everybody.
Thanks
Enjoy the
very
weekend.
much,
Thank you
Julie.
all.
All right, thanks.
Thanks,
Take care.
Natalie. Take care. Nice to meet you.